Imagine the scene. Your 5-year-old son looks at the television screen and, with a voice that doesn't seem to be his, claims to have died in the most tragic wreck in history. Not as a children's play, but with details so accurate that they goosebumps even the most skeptical. This is exactly what happened to a humble family in the mountains of Jalisco, where the smell of newborn coffee mixes with the incense of ancestral traditions. They could never imagine that their quiet life would become one of Mexico's best documented reincarnation reports. It was a rainy night of April 2019. The wind howled outside, beating the wooden windows of the adobe house where the Morales lived in the small village of Tequila. Inside, the warmth of the chocolate atoll that Dona Maricela prepared in the kitchen spread throughout the room, while her husband, Ramiro, a mechanic of the place, tried to fix an old radio on the dining table. His only son, Alejandro, played on the floor of red bricks with wooden trolleys carved by his grandfather. His big, dark eyes shone under the yellowish light of the lamp hanging on the ceiling. That night Ramiro managed to tune into a channel that displayed a documentary about Titanic. The black and white images of the imposing ship filled the old television screen. "Look, my son," said Ramiro, drawing Alejandro's attention. "This boat was bigger than our whole city." But when the first scenes in the interior of the ship appeared, something changed in the boy. His dark face suddenly paled, as if all the blood had been drained. The cards fell from their trembling hands. "No, no, no," he whispered, retreating until he hit the wall. Maricela ran from the kitchen to hear the despair in her son's voice. "What is it, my love?" Alejandro pointed to the television with his trembling finger. On the screen, Titanic's summery first-class hall, with its golden columns and marble stairs, shone in all its lost glory. "I was there," the boy murmured, with a voice that didn't match his 5 years. "I was there when he sank." Ramiro laughed nervously, trying to disguise the discomfort. "Ah, Alejandro, it doesn't invent. This ship sank for over 100 years. But the boy was not kidding. Her eyes filled with tears as she fixed the screen, as if she revived something that no child should know. "My name was Thomas," he said, with a certainty that he froze his parents' spine. "Thomas Andrew. And it was because of my fault that so many people died." A heavy silence took over the house. Only the noise of the rain was heard on the roof of red tiles and the tinnitus of the old apparatus. Maricela knelt beside her son, feeling her heart beaten, like the drums of the ceremonies she had witnessed in childhood. "What are you talking about, my son?" "The ship sank because I did not do it right," he replied, with a pain that did not fit his small shoulders. "I didn't put enough savvy boats. It's my fault." And then, Alejandro began to cry in a way that the soul broke. It was not the cry of a child who wants to draw attention, but someone's weeping carrying a burden that should not exist. That night, while Alejandro slept restlessly in his wooden bed, carved by the great-grandfather, Maricela and Ramiro were awakened in the kitchen, having a pan and trying to understand what they had witnessed. "Do you believe these past lives?" Ramiro asked his wife with a low voice. Maricela looked at the small altar on the corner of the kitchen, where the photos of the ancestors seemed to observe it with ancestral wisdom. "My grandmother always said that the dead come back when they have something important to solve," he replied, while an anguished scream came from his son's room. They ran there and found Alejandro sitting on the bed, sweaty and pale, his eyes fixed in the window, as if he saw something invisible to them. "The water," he whispered, his voice embargoed. "The water is rising. I can't leave. The door is locked." His little hands moved in the air, as if he tried to force a door that only he saw. "Thomas! Thomas!" he shouted, with a hoarse voice that didn't seem to leave a child. "The captain needs me." Maricela hugged him hard, feeling her small body shake like sheet in the wind. "Shoo, my love, you're at home, it's safe," he tried to calm him down. But Alejandro looked at her with a look that had already seen. "To death up close." "Mom," he said, with clarity that terrified her, "why do I remember to die?" This question would be recorded forever in Maricela's heart, because that night, unknowingly, her family had crossed the border between the possible and the impossible, between life and death, between the present and a past that refused to be forgotten. And that was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought of knowing about existence, the memory of the soul, and the mysteries that transcend time. In the following days, the Morales family lived a silent nightmare. Alejandro was no longer the same boy who ran barefoot through the agave fields, chasing butterflies between his grandmother's plants. Now he spent hours sitting in the backyard, drawing with a twig over the damp ground. But they were not childish scribbles, they were detailed plants, complex diagrams, straight lines and numbers that made no sense to a child who could barely write his own name. "Look, mother," said one morning, pointing to the traces on the earth. "Here are the boilers, and here the water pumps, but they are not enough." Maricela knelt beside her, watching those drawings that seemed out of another time. "What is this, my son?" "It's the ship," he replied, his voice embargoed. "My ship. What sank for my fault?" A shiver traveled his column. In their family, women have always had a special connection with the invisible. Her great-grandmother was healer, her midwife grandmother, and she had inherited that sensitivity that captured what others could not see. Now, seeing his son draw plants from a ship that sank decades before he was born, I knew that something deep was happening. That afternoon, while preparing a soft in the stone kitchen, he heard Alejandro's voice in the backyard. He spoke alone, but not as a child who invents imaginary friends. He spoke as who gives orders to a team. "No, it's not like that. Stoning compartments need to be completely prohibited. If the water comes to one, it can't move on to others." Maricela peered out the window. Alejandro was standing in front of a bunch of stones that had arranged in perfect rows, as if they were the sections of a ship. "The problem is in the steel joints," he continued, moving the stones with the accuracy of an experienced engineer. "They are too rigid. When the ice beats, they will break like glass." The wooden spoon escaped his hands. Her 5-year-old son spoke of naval engineering to terms she didn't even understand. And when Ramiro came from work, smelling of oil and grease impregnated with clothes, she knew they would need to face a truth that would change their lives forever. While the smell of hot metal still impregnated his clothes, Maricela told her what she had witnessed. Ramiro, a man with heated hands and practical solutions, shook his head with a gesture of discredit. "The boys repeat what they hear, Mari. Maybe you have seen something on television." But this explanation collapsed the following night, when Alejandro woke up screaming again. This time, they were not just loose words about water and locked doors. This time there were names. "Ismay can't climb this boat. First women and children, you know." Ramiro lit the light. The boy's eyes were open, but fixed on something he only saw. "Captain Smith," continued the hoarse voice of despair. "Water has come to deck and we need to evacuate now." Maricela sat on the bed and pulled her son against her chest, trying to calm him down. "Alejandro, my love, wake up. Are you dreaming?" The boy blinked several times, as if he emerged from a distant place. "It was not a dream, Mom," he whispered. "It was real. I was there. I was Mr. Andrew." "Who is you, Andrew, my son?" Alejandro stared at her with those black eyes that suddenly seemed to carry centuries of memory. "The man who drew the ship. What was until the end trying to save everyone, but couldn't. I couldn't." The next day, Ramiro went to the village cybercafe with a purpose. If his son was inventing names, he would find out. After an hour of slow, unstable internet searches, he found what he was looking for: Thomas Andrews, Titanic's designer. He died in the wreck on April 15, 1912. His hands trembled as he read. Bruce Ismay, director of the company. Captain Edward Smith. All the names Alejandro had shouted in his ways existed. Everyone was in Titanic that night. But what shook him most was a black and white photograph, a young man with dark hair and intense look, dressed in formal costume. Thomas Andrews, at 39, just before the fatal trip. Ramiro studied the image for long minutes. There was something on that strangely familiar face, the expression, the way the lips tightened into concentration. That night, as they had dinner beans and warm tortillas, he put the picture printed on the table. Alejandro, do you know this gentleman? The boy dropped the tortilla. His eyes filled with tears as he saw the image. It's me, he whispered. This is me before. Maricela felt the floor open under her feet. In the photograph, Thomas Andrews had the same expression as his son when he drew. He frowned, the same deep eyes that seemed to see beyond the obvious. Where did you get it, Dad? Asked Alejandro. On the internet, piss. Looking for Titanic. The boy took the picture with his small hands, like a relic. I was younger there, he said, with a naturalness that froze the blood. This photo is from when I finished the final plans. I was so excited. I thought I had made the safest ship in the world. His voice broke. But I was wrong. A lot of people died for my fault. That night Maricela lit candles to all the saints of her altar, but for the first time she didn't know if she asked for protection or understanding. Because his son not only remembered that he was Thomas Andrews, he carried his fault. And this fault, after over 100 years, still burned in the chest of a 5-year-old boy born in the mountains of Jalisco. The news of what was happening at Casa dos Morales spread through the village as a smoke from copal in a sacred ceremony. In Tequila, where everyone knew each other since children, secrets did not last. It was Dona Carmen, the neighbor who sold elotes in the square, the first to listen to Alejandro talking to himself in the backyard on a May morning. The boy built something with stones and sticks, muttering numbers and measures that made no sense to a woman who had passed her life between corn and stoves. 900 feet in length, he said, aligning the stones with surgical accuracy. 170-5 tall, 40-6,000 tons of displacement. Dona Carmen peered over the adobe wall. What are you building, piss? Alejandro lifted his face, the dirty cheeks, his eyes shining with an intensity that did not match his age. Titanic, Dona Carmen. I'm doing the right size, good, smaller, but with the exact proportions. And how do you know these measures, small? Because I drew it, he said, as who says the sun is born in the morning. It took me 3 years in the plans. It was the largest ship in the world. That afternoon, Dona Carmen went straight to Maricela's house. Comadre, your boy is saying very strange things. He speaks as an engineer. Maricela sighed, serving Alia coffee in clay jars. We already know, Carmen. We have been like this for weeks. And they thought of taking Father Miguel? It can be a spirit. Before Maricela answered, Alejandro ran into the kitchen, a paper in his hand. Mom, look what I drew. The paper was covered with lines, numbers and diagrams that seemed out of a technical manual. In the center, a detailed cross-section of a ship with each compartment marked. Here is the problem, said Alejandro, pointing. The bulkheads do not reach the upper deck. When the ship leans, the water will move from one compartment to another. Dona Carmen approached, signing her eyes. What are these numbers, boy? The measurements of each section. And these, traced curved lines with the finger, are the rivets. We use iron rivets in the bow because it was cheaper than steel, but iron is brittle with cold. The two women looked at each other, speechless. A 5-year-old boy explained engineering failures with terms they had never heard. Alejandro, Maricela asked, the trembling voice, where did you learn those words? I didn't learn, Mom. I remember how you remember what you ate at breakfast, only much further. That night, when Ramiro arrived from work, he found his wife sitting at the table, Alejandro's drawing extended under the yellowish light of the lamp. Ramiro, this is not bad. A child doesn't know these things. He studied the roll, his mechanic eyes recognizing the accuracy of the features. That's right, Mari. Very right. The next day, they decided to take a test. Ramiro. The boat began to sink, the water flooded the compartments as if they were drilled buckets. I knew I should have insisted that they would reach Cubierta B at least. But shareholders wanted more room for luxury suites. More money. Always more money. Emiliano Tellez felt his hands sweat. This was not information that set out in documentaries or textbooks. It was an obscure technical detail, debated only in specialized naval engineering circles. He took the notebook out of his pocket, flipping through his notes with trembling fingers. Memperos to Cubierta and commercial decisions overlapping safety. Everything coincided with his deepest research, the ones he had done in the Poe-erect archives of Belfast, where employees looked at him with distrust for being too insistently a Mexican. Alejandro, the teacher's voice came out more hoarse than he intended. Do you remember the day of wreck? What exactly happened? The boy closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving every second. Then he opened them with a frightening clarity. I was in the smoke of the first class when we felt the impact. A deaf sound, as if someone had pulled a piece of hull with a giant knife. I ran to the command bridge. Captain Smith was already there, pale as the snow. It can't be, he repeated. It can't be. But the telegraphs were coming, compartment 1 flooded. Flooded compartment. I knew, teacher. He knew that with 2 full compartments, the boat was sentenced. Mathematics did not lie. Emiliano swallowed hard. 2 compartments. It was exactly the critical limit of Titanic fluctuation, calculated by the engineers of the time. A detail that most people ignored, but he had studied until exhaustion. And the captain? He asked, even though he knew he was entering dangerous territory. What did he do? Alejandro lowered his head, playing with a stone between his fingers. He froze. He was not a bad man, just, he was not prepared for that. When he finally gave the order to prepare the boats, it was late. The women did not want to enter. They thought the boat was indestructible. I had to help put kids in the boats forcibly. Her voice trembled. A mother pushed me when I tried to get her baby. She shouted that she would rather sink with him. I couldn't save even half what I should. The silence that followed was so dense that even the corner of the birds in the backyard seemed muffled. Dona Maricela covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes shining with contained tears. Ramiro, stopped behind the door, squeezed his fists until his fingers were white. Emiliano Tellez was not a man of easy faith. He had dedicated his life to facts, numbers, tangible evidence. But there, sitting on the dirty land in Tequila, before a boy who spoke of remakes and hills with the accuracy of a chief engineer, he felt something break inside him. It was not possible. It should not be possible. Alejandro, he murmured, almost breathlessly, do you know what happened next? After the boat sank? The boy looked at the horizon, where the latest sunlights tinned the rose clouds. I stayed in the water. Not for long. It is too cold to last. But before I left, I saw the boat break in half. A sound like thunder, only worse. As if the world was tearing. He turned his dark eyes to Emilian, and there was a sadness in them that did not belong to a child. Then there was light. A very white light. And a voice that said, you still have work to do. The teacher felt the weight of those words like a blow to the chest. There was no logical explanation. There was no trick, there was no coincidence to justify that. But there was a 5-year-old boy, with his hands still dirty of land, describing the last moments of Titanic with an accuracy that would froze the blood. And the worst of all? He believed in every word. The day when it all started to go wrong. Her small fingers trembled by touching the photograph, as if the paper could burn. Here is Mr. Bruce Ismay, the president of White Star Line, he pointed out with accuracy that creeps. He's talking to the captain. Smith, but it's not happy. I was already pressuring to increase the speed, even with the ice warnings. And there. His voice got lower, almost a whisper, there is my assistant, Carl Juffin. He didn't know yet, but that night he would save dozens of lives. And I. The boy's eyes filled with a shadow that didn't belong to a child. I wouldn't save mine. Dr. Orozco sat on the edge of the chair, his fingers intertwined hard. It was not possible. There was no way. A 5-year-old boy, raised in a village where internet access was precarious and the books about Titanic were just dusty curiosities on local school shelves, could not identify historical figures in a blurred photo of 1912. Much less describe his emotions, his dialogues, as if he had been there. Alejandro, the psychiatrist's voice was carefully neutral, but his hands betrayed tension. How do you know these things? The boy looked at him with an expression that was not a child. It was the look of someone who had already seen the bottom of the ocean. Because I was there, doctor. I drew that ship. I knew every screw, every remache. And when the water started to come in, I knew I had failed. Not only as an engineer, as a man. Silence. Dr. Orozco took another envelope. This time, it was not a photograph, but a technical outline, the original plans of Titanic's staining floodgates, a document that only existed in the Harland and Wolff private archives and some specialized museums. This is wrong here, said Alejandro without hesitation, passing his finger over an almost imperceptible line. They changed the design at the last minute because of the first-class salons. The walls weren't tall enough. I argued with Lord Peary about it, but... His voice broke. But money always speaks louder. The psychiatrist felt a chill through the spine. That was not memory. It was not imagination. It was testimony. Worse, it was a testimony that coincided, word by word, with secret reports of the British Investigation Committee, documents that had only been disqualified decades after the wreck. Alejandro Orozco leaned forward, the voice now urgently. You remember how did you come back? How did you get here? The boy lowered his head. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the tickery of the wall clock, marking seconds that looked like centuries. When he finally spoke, his voice was a sound wire, almost swallowed by the weight of the words. I didn't come back, doctor. I stayed. I stayed at the bottom of the sea, with my boat, for a long time. Until one day, the light came again. And this time, she brought me here. He raised his eyes, and in them there was no fear. There was only such an old sadness that it seemed to have been woven into the fabric of the universe. But I shouldn't be here. Not like that. Not this way. Dr. Orozco leaned back in the chair, his fingers pushing the temples. I had seen cases of children with memories of past lives. He had read about the phenomenon of the prodigy child, about hypermnesia, about transgenerational trauma. But this? This was different. This was as if the story had torn its own fabric to let it escape a fragment of itself. And the most terrifying of everything? Alejandro was not lying. He was not inventing. I was not repeating something I had heard on TV or a book. He knew. And that knowledge was consuming him inside, like Corroy metal acid. When the session ended, Dr. Orozco accompanied the family to the door. Dona Maricela followed in silence, the red eyes of crying. Alejandro, in turn, stopped in the hallway, looking at the steel walls of the building as if they were the bulkhead of a ship. Doctor, he called, without turning around. Do you think one day I'll remember how to be just Alejandro? The question stopped in the air like a blade. Jacinto Orozco didn't have the courage to answer. Southampton, April 10, 1912. Dr. Orozco's voice cut the silence of the office like a sharp blade. Meyer, he is my boat. Alejandro extended his trembling finger at a faded photograph, where the imposing silhouette of Titanic was barely distinguished between the fog of the port. His previously opaque eyes now shone with a light that did not belong to that 10-year-old boy. It was the look of someone who had already seen the sea swallow dreams. This is Mrs. Wid. Enerous, he murmured, pointing to a small figure between the crowd and the pier. She is saying goodbye to her husband and son. They do not know they will never see each other again. Orozco flowered his notes with hands that, for the first time in years, were shaking. The Widener had boarded that day. Had been photographed. And there, in those simple words, it was proof that something far beyond the common memory was happening. And this? The psychiatrist slid another image on the table, the Bevistan shipyards, immense as steel catex. Recognize? Alejandro did not hesitate. He's where we built. The big clerk. We used to lift the whole sections. My workshop was in that building, indicated an almost imperceptible structure in the background, as if time had not erased his presence there. But it was the next photograph that made the air thick. This one came to me without identification. Orozco watched every reaction of the boy. Do you know what it is? Alejandro paled. ESL telegram. His voice was a hoarse whisper, as if the words had been torn from a throat he had already shouted for help once. What we sent asking for help, he continued, his trembling fingers hovering over the yellowed paper where Morse codes intertwined like scars. CQD. CQD MGY. Vengan fast. Motor nuestro is derived. Position 41 degrees 46 north, 49 degrees 57 minutes west. Orozco felt the weight of the story closing over him. Checked the records, the coordinates hit exactly with Titanic's last rescue request. But what came then froze his blood. Alejandro. His voice failed. What date were you born? April 15, 2014. Usco revised the medical record urgently. April 15. The same day that, 100 years earlier, Thomas Andrews had died in the wreck. It was not coincidence. It was an echo. What time is it, Nasista? Dona Maricela answered before the boy could, his eyes wide. Lost 2:17 of La de Dawn. Orozco felt the floor open. He sought his files with feverish hands. Thomas Andrews had been last seen at 2:05 in the smokers. The boat had sunk completely at 2:20. Alejandro had been born just as his previous life had ended. Doctor, Dona Maricela's voice trembled. Is it all bien? Orozco could not answer. Because for the first time he was not dealing with memory, nor trauma or hallucination. I was facing something that science had no words to name. That night, while Guadalajara's lights blinked like dying stars beyond his window, Jacinto Orozco understood that some truths do not fit in diagnoses. Some burdens are not inherited, they are revived. And some blames do not belong to this life, but insist on bleeding over time. Because Alejandro was not just remembering Thomas Andrews. He was paying for him. That was not the fault of a boy playing in a make-believe. It was the real weight of those who carried the consequences of choices on their backs that had changed the course of history. Jacinto Orozco felt the air thick in the living room while watching little Alejandro, whose fingers, still soft childhood, trembled not out of fear, but for an urgency that transcended centuries. Alejandro, said the doctor, breaking the silence with a proposal that he even knew if it was science or despair. Let's try something different. Take this paper. Draw to me. What? Your box. Thomas Andrews's box in Titanic. The pencil touched the sheet like a surgical stylus. For half an hour, the boy traced lines with precision that challenged not only his age, but the logic itself. Each angle, each curve, every architectural detail sprouted from the paper as if it were engraved in its muscle memory. When it ended, what should be a children's scribble was actually a technical project worthy of a naval engineer. A narrow bed. A mahogany desk laden with plans and books. A round window that fits the sea like a vigilant eye. And in the corner, a small porcelain toilet. This is my A36 cabin, Alejandro announced, passing the finger over the drawing as if a memory turned on. Here I kept all my drafts. And at this table? His voice embarked for a moment. Here was my family's photograph in Belfast. Osco compared that outline with the few historical images that he had achieved from the files of White Star Line. The correspondence was scary. Each furniture, each dimension, each shadow of the drawing coincided with the official records. But that's when Alejandro added one last trace, a small hidden suitcase under the bed, that the doctor felt the floor open under his feet. And here, the boy muttered, "Dark, this is where I kept my diary. I wrote in it every night before bed." Orozco knew each line already published about Thomas Andrews. And none of them was mentioning a personal diary. "What did you write in this diary, Alejandro?" The boy's eyes fixed on his with an intensity that did not belong to that child. It did not belong to that century. My concerns about the ship's project. The things I wanted to correct in the next boats. My doubts about some decisions we made during the construction. A thick silence filled the office. Then, with a voice that seemed to echo from a deep back well, Alejandro broke the air. "Doctor. Do you think it's possible for a person to die without finishing something very important? So important that the need to complete this is so strong that she finds a way to return?" The question reached Orozco as a blow to the solar plexus. In decades of study, he had never considered that reincarnation could be less about the soul and more about debt. On interrupted purposes, on responsibilities that refused to rot with the flesh. "Do you think Thomas Andrews had something unfinished?" "Yes," Alejandro answered without hesitation. He needed to learn from his mistakes. He needed to find a way to make safer ships, so that never people would die because of a flawed design. It was then that Jacinto Orozco understood, I was not facing a case of past memories. Was witnessing the continuity of a mission. The stubborn persistence of a man who, even after death, refused to let his last job sink with him. Until, in November 2019, the story of Alejandro Morales crossed oceans. He arrived in the ears of the legendary psychiatrist Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, whose studies on reincarnation had already shaken the foundations of conventional science. Stevenson sent her most experienced researcher, Dr. Patricia Williamson, a woman whose skepticism was as sharp as her methodology. In 2 decades, she had investigated more than 200 cases of children who claimed to remember past lives. He had created protocols capable of separating children's fantasy from genuine memory. And he had published works that forced even the most fierce materialist to question the boundaries between death and consciousness. When her flight landed in Guadalajara at 10 a.m., she brought with her something no one expected: original documents never disclosed, non-existent photographs on the internet, and proof that could once and for all separate the miracle from fraud. The meeting took place at the Usco's office, with the Morales family present. Alejandro, now 5.5 years old, had lost part of the initial shyness, but his eyes still kept that strange flame, as if, behind those children's eyelashes, the fire of a man who had already seen the sea swallowing dreams. "Alejandro," said Dr. Williamson, in a carefully pronounced Spaniard, "brought some things far away. Things that belonged to Thomas Andrews. Things that no one has ever seen." From inside a sealed wooden box, she removed photographs, yellow papers, and personal effects donated by the Andrews family to the university. The first test was a sepia image, a young man curved on a table full of nautical plants. Alejandro didn't even win. "This is my workshop in Belfast," he said, smiling as if he recognizes an old friend. "I'm working on Olympics plans, Titanic's twin brother." The photograph had been taken by Edward Wilding in 1910. This information was only in the family's private archives. "What are you projecting there?" The boy studied the image with attention that seemed to dissolve the time. "Ventilation systems for third-class cabins." It was essential that all passengers had fresh air, not only those of the first class. "That was one of mine." He hesitated. "Priorities." The word sounded like an euphemism. As if, behind it, it squeezed an obsession. "So, Dr. Williamson removed a handwritten document, so fragile that he seemed to disintegrate to the touch. Do you recognize this handwriting? Alejandro held the paper with a reverence that did not match his small fingers. It's my lyrics, he confirmed. A letter I wrote to my mother in December 1911, talking about Titanic's progress. And it started reading aloud despite the archaic English and the tortuous handwriting. Dear Mother, the work on the ship advances better than expected. We install the latest boilers and the electrical systems work perfectly. However, I have some concerns about. Suddenly, he paled. I don't want to read the rest. Why, Alejandro? Asked Usco, feeling his heart beat against his ribs. Because in this letter, your voice has failed. I speak of my questions about the number of lifeboats. I tell her I'm worried, but I trust the ship so much that I think we'll never need them all. Tears ran down his face. If I had heard my own worries, if I had insisted more. Dr. Williamson wrote frantically. The letter, in fact, contained those same doubts described in precise technical terms, with evacuation capacity calculations and security protocols that, if they had been taken seriously, could have saved hundreds of lives. But the definitive proof came when she withdrew the last object of the box. Alejandro. Do you know what this is? It was a brown leather notebook spent by time, as if handled by hands that no longer existed. With the initials TA recorded in the low relief on the aged cover. Alejandro felt the air mist. It's my diary. Her voice trembled, almost inaudible. The personal diary I kept in my box. The fingers brushed the worn leather as if they feared it disintegrated to the touch. The same one that you told me a few months ago, Dr. Orozco? Yes, confirmed Dr. Williamson, opening it with reverential care. This diary was rescued among the belongings of Thomas Andrews, who remained in Belfast. He didn't take him on Titanic. A loaded break. He chose only a small suitcase for the inaugural trip. The pages, yellowed by time, reveal the annotation dated April 8, 1912, 2 days before the ship settled. The letter, firm and accurate, seemed to vibrate with an urgency that transcended decades. Tomorrow I will last review all the security systems. There is a strange restlessness in myself, a feeling I can't explain, as if something warned me to check it out again. Slow-off boats still worry me, although mathematical calculations ensure that the ship remains to light even with 4 flooded compartments. Alejandro listened, his pale face, his eyes wide between the astonishment and a pain that was not just his. The doctor slid her finger by an unhealthy paragraph aloud. Can you continue from here? He asked, indicating the passage. He swallowed hard. The voice that emerged seemed to come from a deep well, as if echoing from another time. I decided to make some last-minute changes in emergency protocols. I will talk to Captain Smith about the possibility of a mock of evacuation during the crossing. Passengers may complain, but I prefer to be overly cautious. Stopped abruptly. The fingers tightened the pages. But I don't remember that. The look, lost, sought that of the doctor. I don't remember wanting to do a simulacrum. Continue, said Williamson, soft. Alejandro obeyed, the voice now a thin thread. Williamson, if something happens to me on this trip, I hope someone learns from my mistakes. The ships of the future should have more savory boats, bulkheads that reach the superior deck and more efficient emergency communication systems. Human life should be worth more than comfort or luxury. The diary closed with a dry crack. Alejandro pressed him against his chest, his shoulders shaken by silent sobs. He knew, he whispered, more to himself than to others. A part of Thomas knew something bad was going to happen, and wrote it as a warning to the future. Dr. Williamson had already witnessed extraordinary phenomena in his career. But nothing compared to that, and devastating mixture of undeniable technical proof and raw emotion, as if the past were bleeding in the present. Alejandro, there is one last thing. He. Wall, choosing the words. In this diary, Thomas wrote something very specific about his plans after Titanic's trip. Would you know what he intended to do? The boy wiped his tears with his back. When he spoke, his voice carried a determination that did not match his 9 years. He wanted to project safer ships. The previously lost eyes now burned with a frightening clarity. Ships where no passenger died from engineering failures. Innovative evacuation systems, instant emergency communications, protocols that place human life above all. He raised his chin, staring at it directly. That's what I'm going to do when I grow up. Finish what Thomas couldn't.